The winter wind cut through Detroit like a blade that morning, carrying with it the hollow groan of a building that had been empty far too long. Snow clung to the broken windows of the old Langston Auto Parts factory, turning the rusted frames into jagged teeth against a gray sky. It was January of 1996, and the demolition crew stood in a half-circle outside, breath hanging in the air, waiting for the foreman's signal. The place had been shut down for more than 20 years, its floors warped, its walls flaking like dead skin, but today it would finally come down. Among the workers was a man named Paul Driscoll, a second-generation construction hand who'd grown up hearing stories about this factory from his fath. His old man had put in shifts here back in the 70s, back when the place still smelled of grease and hot metal. But Paul's voice was quieter than usual that morning, and not just because of the cold. He said it was the way the factory seemed to be watching them. Inside, the air was different, still heavy, their boots echoed on concrete and the sound carried too far, like it was traveling down unseen hallways. Dust lifted in lazy spirals with every step, catching the pale light that bled in through the gaps in the boarded windows. The place felt reluctant, as though the walls themselves knew their time was up. Nobody talked about the rumors, not yet. Not in that first hour when the crew set up their equipment, but everyone had heard them. Stories about missing tools, strange noises in the rafters, and if you listened to the old-timers, about a man who'd walked into the factory one evening and never walked out. It was the kind of story you told over a beer in a low voice, as if saying his name too loud might make him answer. The first blow of the sledgehammer cracked against a brick pillar, a dull thud swallowed by the empty space. The sound made Paul pause mid-swing, his eyes narrowing. He tapped the wall again. This time it sounded different, hollow, but that was later. For now, the day was just beginning, the snow just starting to fall harder, the sky folding in on itself. In a few hours, the old Langston factory would give up something it had hidden for over 2 decades. And when it did, the story of the man who vanished in 1974 would no longer be just a rumor whispered by men who'd seen too much steel and smoke in their lives. It would become something far colder, far heavier. And it would be pulled from the walls brick by brick, until the truth stared back at them in the dust. Samuel Lorne had never been the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. At 5'9", with a lean frame and an easy, almost hesitant smile, he blended into the backdrop of the Langston Auto Parts factory like a gear eye. And a much larger machine. He lived in a modest 2-story house on the east side, the kind with peeling paint on the porch rails and a wind chime that sang in even the faintest breeze. His neighbors knew him as polite, dependable, always offering a nod or a morning as he headed off to work in his faded denim jacket. He was 32 in the winter of 1974, unmarried, though not for lack of opportunity. He'd once been engaged, but that had ended quietly a few years before, with no drama, just a slow drift apart. Since then, Samuel had poured his energy into his job and his sketches. He had a habit of pulling out a battered notebook during his lunch breaks, pencil moving fast over the paper, capturing the curve of a gear, the profile of an engine block, the intricate lattice of pipes overhead. To him, machinery wasn't just metal and grease, it was art. Outside of work, his life was quiet, almost predictable. On Fridays, he'd stop by O'Malley's diner for a slice of lemon meringue pie, always sitting at the same corner booth. Saturday mornings were spent in the hardware store down the block, browsing tools he didn't need but liked to hold, weighing them in his hand as if deciding their worth. On Sundays, he'd visit his sister Evelyn, who lived across town with her 2 kids. They adored their Uncle Sam, especially for the way he could fold a paper crane so perfectly it seemed alive in their small hands. That winter, though, Evelyn noticed something different. He'd started arriving late to their Sunday dinners. Sometimes he wouldn't stay long, giving vague excuses about needing to get back home. He seemed tired, distracted, and once, just once, she caught him staring at the wall behind her kitchen table as if listening to something faint and far Away when she asked what was on his mind, he smiled, shook his head, and changed the subject to baseball. His co-workers, too, saw small changes. He was still precise with his work, but there was a restlessness in the way he moved around the factory floor. He lingered in certain corners, touching the walls as if feeling for something beneath the surface. One friend, Jim Hollies, remembered Samuel standing by the west wall of the loading bay one afternoon, tracing the brick with his fingertips. When Jim asked what he was doing, Samuel had laughed it off, saying, "This place has a memory, you can feel it if you stand still long enough." At the time, no one thought much of it. Factories had a way of getting under a man's skin. The noise, the heat, the rhythm of the machines, they became part of you. But in the weeks before he disappeared, Samuel carried himself like a man with a secret. Something had shifted, quietly, and the people who knew him were left with only the faintest sense that they had been watching a slow unraveling. If anyone had pressed him harder, maybe he would have told them. Maybe he would have shared what was keeping him up at night, or why he'd taken to walking home alone through the narrow back streets instead of catch-high. The bus with the others, but no one did. And so whatever was building in him, whatever was drawing his attention to the cold brick walls of that factory, stayed locked away until the night it all came undone. It was late January when the first real signs appeared, small enough to ignore at first, yet strange enough to leave an uneasy shadow. Samuel began keeping his locker locked at all times, something he'd never bothered with before. He carried his sketchbook everywhere, even to the break room, holding it close to his chest as though it contained something far more valuable than Hind drawings. Jim Hollies noticed he had stopped eating with the others, instead taking his lunch alone on the far end of the factory floor, in a spot where the noise from the presses drowned out casual conversation. One evening after the shift ended, a night watchman named Walter Briggs swore he saw Samuel still inside, long after everyone else had gone. Walter had been making his rounds when he caught sight of a flashlight beam moving slowly along the west wall. At first, he thought it was a thief. But when he called out, Samuel stepped from the shadows, his expression unreadable. "Forgot something," he muttered, before brushing past and heading for the locker room. Walter remembered the way Samuel's boots echoed down the hallway, the sound lingering in the empty space longer than it should have. There were other moments. A coworker recalled hearing Samuel talking quietly to someone in the tool room, only to find him standing alone when they entered. Evelyn, his sister, said he began calling her at odd hours, sometimes just to ask strange questions about their childhood home or whether she believed. People could sense when a place was holding onto something. He'd laugh afterward, trying to make it sound like a joke, but there was always a pause in his voice, like he was weighing whether to say more. The oddest thing came from a young apprentice named Tommy Grant. He told his father, who later told police, that Samuel had pulled him aside one afternoon and asked if he'd ever heard the scratching. Tommy, puzzled, said no. Samuel nodded, looking almost relieved or maybe disappointed. "Never mind, kid," he said, "it's better you don't." The apprentice swore he saw Samuel glance up at the wall above them, his eyes tracking something invisible, before walking away. To most, these were just quirks, the harmless eccentricities of a man who spent too much time around the din of machinery. But to those who looked back later, every detail seemed heavier. The way he lingered near certain walls. The way he started avoiding the loading bay after dusk. The way his hands shook once when he lit a cigarette, as if the air itself had startled him. No one confronted him directly. Maybe they didn't want to intrude, or maybe they were afraid of what they might hear. And so these warning signs piled up quietly like small cracks in a dam, out of sight, out of mind. Until one cold night the cracks would no longer hold. The night of February 22, 1974 was bitterly cold. The wind swept in from the river, carrying with it the smell of frozen metal and exhaust. Inside the Langston Auto Parts factory, the final shift of the week was winding down. The air was thick with the smell of oil and the rhythmic clank of machinery winding to a stop. Men shrugged into their coats, voices echoing in the cavernous space as they called goodnight to each other. Samuel had been working near the west loading bay that evening. Jim Hollies remembered seeing him about 20 minutes before the end of the shift, wiping his hands on a rag, staring at the far wall like he'd forgot. 10 where he was when Jim called his name. Samuel blinked, gave a faint nod and said he'd be along in a minute. At 9:30 sharp, the time clock punched the last cards of the night. A few workers lingered by the lockers talking about the snowfall building outside. Samuel's card was there, freshly stamped. His coat still hung on the hook, his lunch pail empty on the bench beneath it, but Samuel himself was nowhere to be seen. Walter Brigg, the night watchman, said he heard a metallic bang just after the men had cleared out, like a sheet of steel being dropped, followed by a hollow scrape. He called out into the dim hallway but got no answer. Assuming it was just one of the old machines settling, he returned to his rounds. The last confirmed sighting came from Tommy Grant, the young apprentice, who swore he saw Samuel walking toward the darkened tool room just after 9. He thought it was odd, no one ever went in there after hours. He considered following him, but the cold outside was calling, and he didn't want to miss the bus. By the time the watchman made his next pass 20 minutes later, the factory was silent, lights were off in the west wing. The door to the tool room was closed. Samuel's work boots were still by his station, lined up neatly. And from that moment on, it was as if he'd stepped off the face of the earth. The snow outside muffled every sound as the city settled into the night. Somewhere in the darkness of that vast, aging factory, Samuel Lorne had gone, without a cry for help, without a sound loud enough to carry. No footprints in the snow, no sign of a struggle, just an empty space where a man should have been. And the next morning, when they called his name, it was answered only by the echo of their own voices, fading into the cold steel silence. By Saturday morning, word had spread through the neighborhood that Samuel hadn't come home. Evelyn was the first to call the police, her voice tight but measured, as though speaking too fast might make the situation real. Within an hour, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the Langston factory, their headlights cutting through the pale winter light. The building loomed above them, its windows like dark eyes watching the street. The first search began right there on the factory floor. Officers moved through the vast space in pairs, their footsteps echoing, flashlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the shadows. They checked the locker rooms, the break area, the restrooms. They opened storage cabinets and peered behind stacks of wooden pallets. They called his name again and again, each call swallowed by the cold air. By midday, more help arrived. Detectives from the precinct joined in, and soon they were outside, combing the narrow alleys that threaded behind the building. The snow was a problem, thick enough to cover any prints by morning. They followed the street toward the river, checked under the steel loading docks, even pried open rusted dumpsters. There was nothing, no trail. No sign of him heading toward home. When the factory's basement was opened, the air that rushed out was damp and stale. Men descended the narrow stairs with caution, their lights sweeping over pipes that dripped steadily into shallow puddles. The walls were lined with storage cages, most still holding forgotten parts and crates of bolts. In the far corner, a locked utility door had to be forced open. Behind it was only a tangle of old wiring and a collapsed section of flooring, the ground beneath it lost in darkness. No one could see the bottom. Evelyn stood outside the chain-link fence that afternoon, wrapped in her heavy coat, watching as uniformed men moved in and out of the building. Neighbors came by with quiet questions, offering coffee she didn't drink. Someone mentioned seeing Samuel on the street a few nights earlier, carrying a rolled-up sheet of paper under his arm, but they couldn't say where he'd been headed. That evening the police widened their search. Flyers were printed and taped to storefronts, with Samuel's face staring out in black and white. Officers walked door to door, asking if anyone had seen him leave the factory or if they'd heard anything unusual that night. The answers were always the same: no, nothing, not a sound. By the time darkness fell again, the streets were empty, the searchers exhausted. The factory stood silent, its tall brick walls catching the last of the streetlight. Inside, it felt as though the building had swallowed its secret whole, refusing to give anything back. And as the temperature dropped, so did the first wave of hope that Samuel might simply walk through the door. Instead, the night closed in, and the only thing anyone knew for certain was that he had vanished somewhere between the punch of a time clock and the silence that followed. Days bled into weeks, and the case began to thin out like smoke in cold air. At first, there had been a constant hum of motion, uniforms at the factory gates, detectives leaning over maps, the scrape of boots through snow and row alleys, but by mid-February that hum had faded, each new lead unraveled as soon as it was pulled. Someone claimed they'd spotted Samuel boarding a bus to the city, but the security footage showed only a man with the same coat, a stranger with tired eyes. Another tip suggested he'd been seen near an abandoned rail yard, yet when officers searched, they found nothing but wind, rust, and empty tracks stretching into nowhere. Inside the precinct, the investigation board told its own story. Lines of red string connected photographs, dates, and scraps of handwritten notes, but more and more of those lines ended in small X's, marking dead end. Detectives who once spoke with urgency now leaned back in their chairs, rubbing at their temples, muttering about too many cases and too few answers. Evelyn stopped visiting the factory. The first time she'd gone after the initial search, she'd stood at the gate for nearly an hour, staring at the brick walls, willing them to give her anything, a sound, a movement, a sign that he was still inside, but the silence had been too heavy, too complete. By the third week, she'd learned to avoid that street entirely. The neighborhood, too, began to shift. At the start, people left porch lights on, just in case Samuel found his way home late at night. Shopkeepers would ask if there was any news, their voices low, as though afraid the answer might shatter something fragile. But as winter turned toward spring, the lights went dark, the questions stopped, and conversations slipped back into the rhythm of bills, weather, and football scores. There were moments that almost felt like breakthroughs. A scrap of cloth found snagged on a fence behind the factory was sent to the lab, only to be dismissed as nothing more than an old rag. A neighbor swore they'd heard shouting near the loading docks one night, but the timeline didn't match, and no other witness could confirm it. Every potential clue became another weight, dragging the case deeper into still water. For Evelyn, the waiting became a kind of slow suffocation. She kept the phone on the kitchen counter, always within reach, jumping at every ring. Sometimes it was a telemarketer, sometimes a wrong number, but each time for a split second she let herself believe it might be him. At night she dreamed of footsteps in the hall, of the sound of his key turning in the door, and every morning she woke to the same stillness. By late March, the official search had been scaled back. The detectives didn't say it outright, but the meaning was clear. Without new evidence, there was nowhere else to look. Files were stacked neatly in labeled boxes, placed on a shelf alongside dozens of other cold cases. And with that, Samuel Langston's name became just another in a list of unsolved disappearances, a question with no answer, waiting for something, anything, to stir the stagnant air again. It wasn't until years later, long after the official search had gone cold, that the Langston factory came into focus again. The building had been sitting vacant, its windows boarded, its gates chained, the brickwork scarred with graffiti. Most people avoided it. Kids dared each other to sneak inside, but even they rarely got far. The air inside was too heavy, too still, as if the walls remembered more than they wanted to tell. In the spring of 1991, a development company purchased the property with plans to tear it down and replace it with apartment blocks. Within days, crews in hard hats arrived, their voices echoing through the empty space. They pulled down the rusted machinery, stripped out old wiring, and brought in bright lights that chased away decades of shadows. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the building was alive with noise. One of those workers, a man named Frank Doyle, had been assigned to the West Wing, the same part of the factory where Samuel was last seen. His job was to help dismantle an interior wall that had been sealed off sometime in the late 70s. The concrete was thicker than expected, reinforced with steel beams that seemed oddly out of place for an interior partition. Frank joked to his crew that someone must have been hiding treasure in there. The foreman laughed it off and told him to keep moving. By mid-morning, Frank's hammer hit something that didn't sound like concrete. It gave off a dull, hollow ring. Curious, he knocked again, then chipped away more plaster. Beneath it was a panel of old wood discolored with age. The grain was warped, but the surface was strangely smooth, as if it had been polished at some point. Frank paused, called for another worker, and together they pried the panel loose. What they found wasn't treasure. It was a narrow cavity, no more than 3 feet deep, running the length of the wall. The air that seeped out was stale, carrying a faint, metallic tang. Inside, tucked against the far end, was an object wrapped in layers of oilcloth. Frank hesitated, his gloves brushing the brittle fabric, before carefully pulling it free. The weight of it was wrong, not heavy like metal but not light either. The crew gathered around, their voices dropping without reason, as Frank began to peel back the cloth. The folds came apart slowly, each layer revealing more of what lay inside. It wasn't until the final corner fell away that anyone realized the room had gone utterly silent. No machines, no chatter, just the sound of breathing. And in that stillness, every man standing there knew, without speaking, that the past they were about to touch had been waiting a very long time to be found. The oilcloth unfurled like a reluctant secret, releasing a faint, acrid smell that made the men instinctively lean back. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind you might expect to find in an attic, not sealed behind reinforced concrete. Its surface was scratched, but someone had once taken care to varnish it, the sheen still visible beneath the dust. A brass latch, tarnished green with age, clung stubbornly to the front. Frank glanced at the foreman, who gave a quick nod. The latch snapped open with a brittle crack, and the lid lifted on hinges that groaned like they hadn't been touched in decades. The first thing anyone noticed was the envelope, resting neatly on top. It was thick, its paper yellowed and fragile, with a name scrawled across it in dark ink, Samuel Langston. No one spoke. Frank reached for it, his gloves leaving faint smears of dust on the paper, but he didn't open it. Instead, he set it aside and looked deeper into the box. Beneath the envelope lay a folded wool coat, its fabric matted and stiff. In one of the pockets was a silver pocket watch, the glass face cracked, the hands forever frozen at 2:17. At the bottom, half buried beneath the coat, was a leather-bound notebook. The spine was worn and the cover had softened with age. Frank hesitated, then opened it just far enough to see the handwriting inside, dense, hurried, lines of ink that dipped and slanted as though the right R had been racing against time. A few words stood out in the dim light. They know, I can hear them in the walls. The room felt colder now, though no one had touched the thermostat. One of the younger workers, a man named Lewis, let out a low whistle and muttered something about taking it to the police. But the foreman shook his head, eyes fixed on the box. We finish the job first, he said quietly, then we decide. Frank closed the notebook and placed it back in the box, the way you might return something sacred. As he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in that factory so many years ago hadn't stayed buried at all. It had been waiting, patient and silent, for this very moment to breathe again. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The image of the box kept flashing in his mind, the envelope with Samuel's name, the cracked pocket watch, the frantic scrawl in the notebook. He tried to tell himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, he felt the weight of it, like he had been handed something that wasn't his to carry, yet couldn't be put down. By morning, the demolition crew was back on site. The West Wing felt different now. Even the sound of sledgehammers striking concrete seemed muted, as if the walls themselves were listening. Frank kept the box close, tucked inside the cab of his truck. He hadn't opened the envelope, though his fingers itched too. The name alone was enough to make his chest tighten. Samuel Langston wasn't just the factory's founder. He was the man whose disappearance had fueled decades of rumors in the town. During lunch, Lewis slid onto the tailgate of Frank's truck and gave a low whistle at the box. You ever gonna look? He asked. Frank shook his head. Some things, they're not meant to be rushed. Lewis smirked but didn't push. By late afternoon, they were tearing into the last section of the wall. That's when they found it, another cavity, smaller than the first, hidden behind a layer of rusted sheet metal. This one wasn't empty. Inside, wedged tight between the studs, was an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. The casing was dented, the reels dusty but intact. A paper label curling at the edges bore a single date, March 12, 1974. The crew gathered again, the way people do when they sense a moment might matter. Frank lifted the recorder out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, the metal cold against his palms. No one had the equipment to play it right there, but the presence of it paired with the box felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly clicking into place. The foreman's voice broke the silence. "Lock it in the office," he said. "We'll deal with it tomorrow." But Frank, standing there with the recorder in his hands, wasn't sure tomorrow would make it any easier. If anything, he had the sinking feeling that whatever story the walls had been holding back was about to come out, and no one on that crew would walk away unchanged. The following morning, a pale mist clung to the ground, turning the demolition site into something that felt more like a forgotten graveyard than a construction zone. Frank arrived earlier than the rest of the crew, the box and the tape recorder sitting side by side on the passenger seat. He had barely touched his coffee, his stomach too knotted to care. When the foreman showed up, he tossed Frank a set of keys, old, brass, and clearly not for anything on the site. "Found these in the office safe," he said. "Might be for that box or maybe something else." Frank caught them, feeling the cold weight in his hand. He didn't respond, but the thought of opening the envelope, the box, and now possibly unlocking something else made his pulse quicken. By mid-morning, the others had arrived. Work began in a half-hearted rhythm, everyone's mind split between the job and the strange discoveries. Lewis kept glancing at the tape recorder like it was some kind of time bomb. Around noon, Frank finally gave in. He set the recorder on the hood of his truck, checked the reels, and noticed a faint smell of dust and oil. "It's still wound tight," he murmured. "Might actually play." They didn't have a real player, but Tom, one of the electricians on the crew, mentioned he had one in his garage. Within the hour, they were crowded into the dim space, the air smelling faintly of old wood and gasoline. Tom threaded the tape with a care that made Frank realize just how old this thing really was. When the reels began to turn, the first sound was static, deep, rolling static that almost masked the faint hiss of a man clearing his throat. Then came a voice, low, uneven, the kind that makes you lean closer without meaning to. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, "then the walls didn't keep them out and I didn't make it." The room went dead silent. Frank's skin prickled as the voice continued, weaving a story that was less about machinery and more about something moving in the factory at night. Mething that whispered in the dark and made the walls hum. The recording cut off mid-sentence, the reel spinning freely. No one moved. Outside, the mist had burned away, but the air in the garage felt heavy, like the voice had left something behind. Frank glanced at the others and saw the same thing he felt in their eyes, an understanding that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Frank stood in the fading light, the box still unopened, the tape recorder locked in the foreman's office. The factory walls were almost gone now, just piles of brick and twisted metal, but somehow the place felt more alive than it had in years. The voice on that tape had left its mark, not just in the air but in each of them. Questions hung heavier than the dust. Who was Samuel Langston speaking to? What had he seen, and what exactly had the walls been keeping out? Frank knew one thing: he wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. The truth was buried here, deeper than the foundation, and every instinct told him that finding it would come with a cost. Still, some mysteries aren't meant to be left alone. If you've been following this story, if you felt that same pull to know what's hiding just out of sight, then don't look away now. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who's not afraid of the dark, and join me as we dig deeper into what really happened inside those walls, because something tells me the most unsettling part hasn't even been uncovered yet.